Okay, before getting to today's interview, I think it's worth addressing a few things at the jump. First and foremost, we like Andy. We also like the ATC, and no conversation or any act of journalism is really ever truly objective. And we want to make it crystal clear our biases and acknowledge them up front here. That said, I also do think we can have a productive conversation about some of the challenging subjects surrounding the AT community and the ATC happening right now. Today's February 23rd. And I hope that we can at least somewhat advocate for those who have, some tougher questions for the ATC. But let's do it. Let's jump right to our interview with Mr. Andy Downs. So I'm curious to know what the trail maintenance on the AT looked like in 2020, because obviously when shit hit the fan in March, I assume people were not out actively on the trail because there was this perception that leaving your house equated danger. So I'm curious to get your perspective on when things kind of resume normalcy from a trail maintenance standpoint.
I mean, yeah, in March, April, May, almost no volunteering happened on the AT, which is wild to say. Like, I never thought I would say that. And then we kind of learned more and more and more about the virus, and we're able to kind of adapt, the guidance we provided volunteers and how those operations happened. And I think maybe last October, we got to a point where the volunteers could kind of bring specific issues to the agency, Forest Service, Park Service, state, whoever it was, and then deal with that specific issue on a case-by-case basis. Like Privy's overflowing, needs to be moved. Okay, you can go do that. It used to be, and it was normally, volunteers would just do that when it became necessary, but because of this heightened level of concern, and because we didn't really have great data, in the beginning. It was just like, I don't know, wash your groceries,
Yeah.
So we were just trying to do as good as we could to keep everybody safe and be as conservative as possible, given the kind of high stakes there. So I think things have gotten more normal since then. They're definitely not normal now, but one thing that's happened, I think, is a lot of volunteers have been sharing a lot of information among themselves, and going to this kind of Zoom-based communication structure has really improved the communication among volunteer groups and among ATC in some ways. So there kind of has been, I won't even call it a silver lining because, so much tragedy has occurred, but we've adapted, and I think continue to.
I actually think this is worth touching on, and I'm sure we did during the last episode, but can we talk about the chain of command for how the ATC interfaces with the trail maintenance clubs and the trail maintainers themselves? And then I guess within that question is like, what is it specifically that the ATC does?
Just a quick question like that. ATC is the overall coordinating entity, and you can kind of imagine it like the center of the hub of a wheel. So the Department of Interior administers the Appalachian Trail and the National Scenic Trail, National Trail System Act, delegate a lot of responsibility to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. We re-delegate that to 31 independent trail clubs up and down the trail, and act as a coordinating agency, not only between the volunteer organizations and the agencies themselves, but also among all those groups in a system called the cooperative management system. It's a consensus-based approach to managing things, and really focused on grassroots leadership of the resource management, because that's essentially how the AT was constructed in the first place. So we have what's called an adaptive recovery task force when it comes to COVID. It's made up of agency people and volunteers and ATC and infectious disease experts, and we collaborate on solutions to a variety of problems that COVID creates, to come up with policies that we then provide the clubs. And so there's no like legal requirement that the clubs follow that. They're independent organizations, and their agreements that allow them to volunteer essentially are with the agencies, right? We delegate authority for management, but they are covered allowed to manage essentially, or allowed to do their work because they're independent agreements with the agency. What we try to do is just provide the best possible information and solution. Like we try to invent the best mousetrap for them to use, essentially. So we try to give the best rules for their clubs to follow, and then work that with the agency, so the agency could essentially stamp it pretty quickly and say, oh, you're following ATC's guidance. We worked on developing that guidance with you. Therefore, we're good to go. I know that's confusing, but the AT management is essentially confusing.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's also unfair to ask you to summarize the ATC in 3 minutes. Does the ATC provide any funding to the trail maintenance organizations or supplies?
Yeah. I mean, one of our primary jobs is to make sure that volunteers have the tools, training, and equipment necessary to manage a public resource, a national park unit for the government. So we ensure volunteer management of the AT to the National Park Service, and the way we do that is train volunteers when needed, provide them equipment when needed, do everything we can to make volunteering on the AT as streamlined as possible, as fun as possible, with as little bureaucracy as possible. And I got to tell you, that's a ton of work because there's a lot of paperwork involved. There's a lot. I mean, if you want to run a chainsaw on public land, you can just imagine like how much paperwork and bureaucracy goes into that. Chainsaw is a dangerous thing. But the kind of fundamental principle of the AT is that locally based people are the primary stewards and advocates for the trail itself. And so our job at ATC is to provide them voice and platform, and also training and capacity and skills development and access to the sort of decision-making echelon of the National Park Service and of the Forest Service and of the land management agencies that kind of protect the body of the trail.
And the Ridgerunner program is run through the ATC, correct?
The Ridgerunner program is administered through the ATC. There are, I think, at one point recently, there's like 31 or 32 Ridgerunners. About half of those are direct hires from ATC. And then the other half, some of them we provide money and the clubs hire them or the states hire them. It's a kind of variety from the rest, but we provide funds for all those. We also provide funds for trail crews to support clubs in doing their work. We buy tools and equipment and materials for the clubs all the time through a variety of resources. And then we ensure that the clubs and the agencies themselves have a great working relationship. So when we do run across the massive problems like we were just talking about, that power line down, like there's already a good relationship there. So there's not this communication barrier that would then have negative repercussions for the trail itself. Like they all know each other, they all work together really well, they all know what each other's plans are, and strengths and weaknesses and limitations, and it's an effective partnership. And ATC's job is essentially to steward that partnership for the benefit of the trail itself.
Okay, I don't want to bury the lead too much here. I know you've been talking about this probably nonstop for at least the last week or so. I'll let you speak to that, but let's talk about the pipeline specifically. What's been making news of late is the Mountain Valley pipeline. So can we start with the history of the pipeline and how that interfaces with the Appalachian Trail?
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is super long. So that pipeline was proposed in 2015. I've been working on it since then. It was proposed across the AT, very near to our regional office, about 50 miles away. Our position at ATC, there are 58 pipelines across the AT. There are over 100 power lines, obviously tons of roads, all sorts of stuff, and more proposed each day. And our fundamental kind of marching orders there are to work with all these developers essentially to minimize their impact to the trail, right? We want to have win-win solutions. We want to make sure that they have all the best techniques in like how they site power line towers, or how they treat their corridor to just minimize all impacts. And in general, that works really well. I mean, even these developers, they don't want to hurt the AT. So, and we've been around forever. We've been around since 1925. So usually we're a very known quantity. With Mountain Valley Pipeline, that wasn't the case. We did not have, I think from the get-go, we did not have real access to kind of talk about AT, how to minimize impact to the trail, the potential impact for the trail. We didn't feel like that information was being presented to the public in a transparent way. And so sometime in 2016, I believe our board voted to oppose that project. And that was the first pipeline we'd ever opposed. I've worked on maybe not dozens, but a lot of power lines. We've also not opposed any of those. That was the first one. And, essentially because we didn't feel that AT issues were being explained to the public effectively. And we didn't feel like we had access to the organization to affect change there, right? Because this thing was going to cross the AT or propose across the AT. And, a big project can have really minimal impact if you do it right. And a small project can have a really big impact if you do it wrong. And so we really wanted to get in there and essentially teach them about how to minimize impact to the trail. So that was 2016. Did a lot of advocacy work, did a lot of work around the regulatory process. That's all in the weeds. I can talk about that more if you want, but it's pretty boring. And then I think 2017, maybe, or 18, there was a court decision that essentially said that the Forest Service permit process to cross the AT was adequate, right? That had done their job. And leading up to that, we had done a ton of work saying, look, you haven't done an adequate job. You need to do more. And the Forest Service required Mountain Valley Pipeline to do a lot of work. I mean, I think initially they didn't have a single visual impact simulation. So that is kind of, you take a picture of a view and then you overlay what you think, the power line or the pipeline is going to look like on it. And then the public can say, oh, that's not that bad. Or, oh, that is terrible. And it's not worth having this power line there. But there were none of those in the original environmental work. And we did a ton of advocacy trying to get them to do that, which they finally did. And then we'd had them redo it. And it was this whole big, very laborious process. But in the end, that kind of got looked at by the courts, and the courts revoked Mountain Valley's permit to cross Forest Service land, but essentially said that the specific work that they did for the AT was adequate. And so we were kind of left in this situation where I was like, all right, well, we're not thrilled about, this pipeline. The court has said that they did an adequate job analyzing impacts to the trail. So sort of where does that leave us? And then in 2018-ish, a lot of these dates blend together for me, so I'm trying to be as accurate as possible. The pipeline leadership turned over. They reached out to us again and said, hey, we recognize that there's impacts to the trail, impacts to this landscape. We'd like to be better sort of corporate citizens here. Are you guys willing to kind of entertain a conversation about how we can support the AT, and in doing that, support the vast array of recreation economies in Virginia, in Central Virginia particularly. And at that time, we had learned that although we had hoped that the AT would stop this pipeline, we had learned essentially that it wasn't going to do that. And so we decided to kind of make some lemonade and entertain those conversations and see if there was a positive outcome possible for the trail itself. And those conversations essentially led to Mountain Valley Pipeline pledging up to $19.5 million to support land protection for the trail and to support ATC's ability to kind of buoy and support recreation economies in the sort of impacted area. So we decided to move forward with that. It's the largest single gift to the ATC, I believe, in the history. We still are fully engaged in the regulatory process. So, there's still tons of stuff ongoing. There's still a pretty significant analysis of impact to the trail. And we still have a really kind of robust ability to change this project way more than we did in 2016, frankly, to change this project in ways that minimize impacts to the trail, like visual impacts, like standing on an overlook and seeing the pipeline corridor in the distance and things like that. So that's kind of where we are. And I've been sort of out here. I've been the primary on this project for the past 6 years. So I've been doing my best to explain to people who love the trail why we got involved in this and what we think the benefit for the trail is going to be.
Now, listening to you explain that sounds incredibly reasonable to me. I'm curious, could you take a stab at, it's called steel manning, the opposition's argument, like why someone who is very upset about this, and we can talk about rumor and potentially some ignorance that's happening in the social media sphere, but somebody who listened to you make that argument, they're sitting at home banging on their desk and they're saying what?
Well, I don't want to do that. There are people out there who have a variety of problems with the pipeline, with ATC, with whatever. And if I were to present my perception of their arguments, it would ultimately fall way short of their ability to kind of express that. So I won't do that. But I will say, underline a lot of frustration with ATC and making this agreement with Mountain Valley Pipeline, I think is a misconception about who ATC is. And ATC is not at its core an environmental organization like the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy or something like that. We are a conservancy of one specific resource and one specific resource only, and that's the AT. Like we focus everything on the trail itself. A lot of that work has significant environmental benefit, obviously. Protecting land for the trail also protects wildlife habitat and improves, fights against forest fragmentation, improves water quality, and tons of stuff like that. We don't do that work because it's good for water quality. We do that work because it's good for the trail experience. And I think there's, maybe a misconception among some, not all people, but among some people, that ATC is this, this environmental organization, that this broadly focused environmental organization that does all this sort of, environmentally focused work. But the reality is like, we have one yardstick. Is it good for the trail? If it's good for the trail, we try and do it. And if it's not good for the trail, we don't do it. And so I've actually had some relatively meaningful conversations over social media lately where I kind of explain that. And I think some people kind of understand now. I'm not suggesting that the work of the Nature Conservancy and Sierra Club and all these other isn't good. It is good. They are mission driven by their own missions to do good environmental work, and I think they do a great job. But our mission is to protect, advocate, and manage the Appalachian Trail. It's very simple. And so we found over the past 100 years, the best way to do that is, if at all possible, work with these types of energy infrastructure companies for the best possible outcome for the trail. Because, like I said, I've worked on 3 pipeline projects now, and probably twice as many power lines. We're really good at affecting change with those projects. We're not set up to successfully oppose those. And I'll just mention, some of the management documents for the AT kind of, speak to that, like the forest management plan for the Appalachian Trail. allows for utility corridors. It says it in there. Utility corridors are acceptable. What the companies have to do is identify the potential impacts for the trail and address them. And that is essentially what led us initially to vote to oppose that project, because they weren't identifying to the public. And over years of advocacy now, we finally got them to identify those, which is why I think the court made the ruling that it did. But now I've forgotten your question.
No, you answered it. I mean, you didn't answer it, but you answered why you didn't answer it, which was, I think, adequate. If that makes any sense.
There we go.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
But
yeah,
go ahead, Chaunce. Sorry, I've been talking quite a lot.
Oh, I was just gonna ask the next question. That's fine.
Go for it.
I didn't know if you had anything else. I was gonna ask why this is big news, like right now. Like, wasn't this announced last summer by the ATC?
Yeah, this was announced last summer. We did a whole round of media last summer about it. I think I don't necessarily want to speak to why it's popping up now, but if people weren't around to see all that media, that press release, us talk to reporters, us to go over that stuff, last year, if that didn't reach people who love the AT, that's okay. And we're willing to get back out in front of folks and answer the questions they have now. And so that's why we're doing all this over again.
Yeah, that has been a thing that has been confusing to me is when I first read about this, I don't know, a few weeks ago, a month ago, I forget the exact timeline at this point, but it was being presented as if you guys were withholding the information that you had accepted money from MVP. And someone in the comments very accurately posted the link to your press release, which I think was dated in August of last year or something like that. So that part was just strange to me. I also know that it seems like people are frustrated by the fact that not all of the details of the agreement are being disclosed. Can you speak to what's not being disclosed and why that is the case?
Can I disclose what's not being disclosed?
Exactly. I guess that's a good point.
Yeah, no, I can talk about that. So, starting with the kind of basics first, the general first. It's policy and I think good practice not to disclose information about gifts to the AT or to nonprofits in general. That's, from what I understand, that's general operating procedure. I think why is that important? Well, there's information about the application of those funds, I think, in part, that is probably not good for the trail to kind of advertise far and wide. I think also it should be known that, having a private agreement was kind of agreed upon when we enter negotiations, and we're thinking, if we don't like this is not good for the AT, then we just walk, and that's fine. So there's a few different reasons, but what I will say is I think this is clearly and demonstrably overall good for the trail, and I know that people want accountability and should ask for and demand accountability from the ATC, because we take care of something that is so near and dear to so many people's hearts. And we take that very seriously. I take that very seriously because, like I said before, the AT changed my life for the better, and I am forever in its service. So accountability is important. I think the accountability here comes into play as we apply these funds. We have said these funds are going to be dedicated to the protection of the AT experience, the AT corridor. We're a nonprofit. All our accounting information is public knowledge. We file public information every year. Hold us accountable to how we spend that money. I think that's very important and appropriate. So,
can you speak to the $1 million bonus that you got from this?
I wish. Gosh, we were just talking earlier. I don't know, about how COVID has affected my family economy, we'll say, and so. But no, my salary, our CEO's salary, all that stuff is public knowledge. People can go and look at it. This fund is specifically dedicated to the protection of the AT, and it's also specifically dedicated to a physical geography. Like, we can't go spending this money in Maine or Georgia. This is for Central Virginia. Why that's important is because Central Virginia in places is really underprotected. I mean, the AT kind of, anybody who's hiked in Virginia knows it follows these long ridge tops, right? And then sinks down into the valley and then jumps on another mountain and goes for another 50 miles on top of this mountain. Mm-hmm. A lot of those in-between places, the trail is on a super narrow corridor. I mean, you guys thru-hiked, I'm sure you saw signs that said the AT in this area is on a narrow private land corridor, please stay on the trail. That is not the ideal setting for the trail. Like, we want a lot more corridor to protect the AT experience, and work every day to get that, So, there's this misconception, I think, out there that the AT is somehow done, right? That it's this like finished little thing, and it's not. It is vastly underprotected in a lot of places. That frankly, as a hiker and as an employee of ATC is unacceptable, and we got to get up every day and work on that.
Mm-hmm.
So is a lot of the money going to go to rerouting parts of the trail in Virginia to make them in a larger corridor?
No, not necessarily rerouting it. The AT, so from 2013, the AT is now on its preferred location in almost everywhere. I think there's a mile down near I-77 that's not exactly where we want it, but overall, it is. Now, the footpath itself sometimes is on land that the Park Service owns or the Forest Service owns, or state parks or other people. But a lot of times it's on land that, the Forest Service just has an easement on, just has a right-of-way on, that the underlying land is owned by a private citizen. And that easement is minimal. Sometimes it's like 30 feet, right? Which is very small. And so we want to apply these funds to buy that underlying fee land and widen that corridor so somebody can't, cut timber all the way within 30 feet of the trail, or sometimes even closer. So people can't build, a giant, Family Dollar right next to the trail, or 7-Eleven. They can do whatever they want. It's private land. And so, and there's a lot of these places. There's a ton of places like McAfee Knob, for example, a landscape I work a lot in to protect land there. You look at the McAfee Knob view, and a lot of it, that sort of iconic picture of the hiker on the edge, and you got a lot of that stuff in the background, people could just clear cut. People could just, put up a friggin' amusement park there and put up a big sign that says backpacker radio sucks. Like, they can do whatever they want. And, our job is to preserve and hopefully ultimately improve that view, that experience you get up there. And it takes a lot of horsepower. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of this money. Another place we want to spend this money that's talked about in the press release is we want to support the recreation economies that are in and around the AT, that rely on the AT, that provide a better setting and a more robust kind of economy for the people in that area to get out there and enjoy those natural places, to build businesses around access to the outdoors, all that fun stuff, and that's super important as well. A lot of this landscape was like ravaged by the decline of the coal industry, or what have you. And so we want to make sure that recreation-based economies, natural resource-based economies, are strengthened in that area, and some of this money will be spent on that as well. And all that stuff, like I said, hikers and people who are interested should hold us accountable for applying in a responsible way. Our plan is to be completely transparent on how we apply those funds, the land that we're protecting, the way we support recreation economies in this area. And we want as many people to know about that as possible. We think it's important work. It's definitely important for the AT. So that's forthcoming. That will be happening for a long time because of the size of this gift. And so it's not like it's going to be happening, overnight. Although already we were really lucky, I think, to be able to move quickly on a couple of key parcels and properties that we would normally have to wait years for and might not compete well for AT protection. But we've already acquired about 600 acres of critical land for the AT, which is well, we're talking 6 months, which is no small feat. So something I'm really glad we've done.
I'm glad that we have you on for this conversation, because I know that fighting the pipeline for a long time was one of your core, I don't know if it was projects or assignments or just a passion, but I think it's good to have you on, because I feel like you can empathize with somebody who's upset about this, because the ATC was obviously leading, as you put it, leading the charge in fighting the pipeline. And now all of a sudden it seems like you've done a 180 and you're on the other side of it. So I guess I'm just curious to hear from your standpoint, like, can you empathize with somebody who is confused by what's happening? Hopefully after hearing your explanation, they've got a better understanding, but like on paper, if you're not following the particulars of it, can you understand where somebody would be like, wait?
Yeah. I totally understand. And I think part of it is time and timing. So 2016, our board votes to oppose Mountain Valley Pipeline. 2018 or 19, we agreed to accept this money to protect the trail from the pipeline company. In between that, a few really critical things happened. One, they put hundreds of miles of pipe in the ground. Like during that period of super active opposition, the pipeline kept marching through, and a lot of the impacts that were the foundation of our opposition happened, right? I mean, it's there. Like I drive by it almost every day. So it's not like we were opposed on Monday and then we accepted the money on Wednesday, and by Friday, it's not like that. It was years and years and years of work to bring the information about impacts to the trail to the public, to hold the Forest Service and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, feet to the fire to make sure they were analyzing impacts to the trail. And that was a ton of work. I mean, ATC put, thousands of dollars into that, and then have that work essentially evaluated in court. And at that point, the other big thing that happened during that time was the court said the analysis of impacts to the trail was adequate. And so, at that point, we're like, all right, we got all these lemons. What the heck do we do with them? So I understand people when they kind of read an article real quick, they're like, oh, they were opposed, and then they took this money, and now what? But the reality is, we voted to oppose. Years of pipeline construction happened. The court said that the AT wasn't going to stop the pipeline, and I think honestly, for a lot of people who are upset by this agreement that the ATC has entered in, they also recognize that the AT was not going to stop this pipeline. And so what we're left with, I think, is what's our ability to utilize these funds for the best outcome not of the ATC, right? Best outcome for the trail itself. And again, that's where I think that hikers, people who are interested, should really pay attention over the coming, weeks, months, and years, because there better be a lot of good for the trail that comes out of this. And we should be telling people that story. And if we're not, then that's a problem. But if we are, then I think people should take that into their kind of decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. So I'm also curious, and maybe this is part of what's buried in the deal, but are you required to...
There's nothing buried in the deal.
Well,
just
details that can't be disclosed, but the ATC's obligation to this, are you required to advocate for the pipeline, or are you just required to not fight it anymore?
So first of all, first of all, the deal is private because the policy of the AT and ATC and a lot of nonprofit organizations is information about gifts are private agreements between the donor and the recipient, right? It's not private because there's all this secret information in there that we don't want people to know. It's private because in general, donations from whatever company, whoever, are considered private. So in this particular situation, there is information that I think about the application of those funds, like what lands we want to buy. We don't necessarily want to advertise that, far and wide, because we've already had situations on the AT where, our priority list for lands that are important for the AT got out, somebody else bought them and then jacked up the price on them, So things like that are a consideration, but not the only reason. I mean, I think there's, like I said, a variety and a suite of reasons why agreements like this are held private. So just want to make that point.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem.
So I guess this part of the agreement is not this is not being concealed, but what is your obligation to the further advancement of the MVP? Because it's not settled in stone that it's actually going to go through the AT, or is it? Like, that's still to be settled, right?
So our board hasn't amended their vote to oppose the pipeline. We still, are active in the regulatory process to make sure that the pipeline both talks about the potential impacts to the AT in ways that are accessible to the public, right? And we can understand, everybody can understand, and then we can collectively address or evaluate. So we are still completely, nothing about this agreement silences the ATC or our ability to advocate for the trail. Absolutely not. That's something that we would have just walked away from. I don't care how much money you got. Like, we're going to bail if we can't completely and thoroughly advocate for the trail in any context. So that's there. But the agreement, so Mountain Valley Pipeline pays as they go, right? So as they impact more, as they construct more, they pay more, essentially. And for us, our position is and has always been, we'd prefer to not have the money and not have the pipeline. It's not rocket science. We were pretty clear. I mean, we were in papers for years and years and years, opposing the pipeline, against the pipeline. We'd prefer not to have the pipeline and not to have the money. And if Mountain Valley Pipeline does not want to pay the rest of the money, that's great. Stop doing the project. Don't pay us the money, and we'll all go home. It's very simple. So we have no obligation to MVP to be some sort of booster to see the project through. I mean, the reality is because we weren't in a position, ATC or the AT, to stop the pipeline, we don't really have a lot of things they want, right? I mean, there's no permit that they need to cross from ATC or to cross the trail that they weren't already going to get, that the court already didn't say that they could access with the given level of analysis, without the money, right? So they don't need anything from us to get their project done. So we don't have anything to give them, essentially. So what we do provide, the service we provide, is to apply their money. And if, I've said this before, if somebody can come up with a better way to spend their money, tell me. But we apply their money to what we consider the greatest benefit for the trail and in support of the economies that rely on the trail. And, that is the service we're providing. We're applying these monies in the best way we see fit. We are good at that because we've got 100 years of information about what's good for the trail. And so we are essentially an effective conduit for the application of those funds. But as far as some sort of green light they would get, or some cheerleader squad, that ain't us.
Yeah. Got it. So the devil's advocate position, somebody who's upset, somebody who's got their pitchfork and their torch right now, they are saying that you are, in a way, you're incentivized for the project to be completed, because in your own terms, the money that would come from the gift would do more good than the harm that is done through the creation of this pipeline. And they feel like they've lost their biggest ally in fighting against the pipeline. So that's why they're upset.
Yeah, like I said, I completely understand that. I mean, we've provided a platform, I think, for opposition in the past. And we're part of this sort of network of opposition. I think the reality is that the end game for a lot of people was different than the end game from us. I mean, like I said earlier, we don't oppose whether it's coal-fired transmission lines or pipelines or whatever, any of this linear infrastructure. We don't oppose it out of hand just because it crosses the AT. We oppose it because of impacts to the trail, right? Once those impacts are on the ground, I mean, like, that's kind of the end game for us. The whether or not the pipeline gets built is not as much of an issue as the physical actual impacts that result from it. And once those impacts occur, it's like, all right, how can we make the best of this situation? So I think there are some people out there who are like, no pipeline, no way, never, no pipelines ever. And, that's their position. And I applaud them for having a purposeful stance. Our position is not no pipeline, no transmission line, never. Our position is we want to minimize or eliminate potential impacts, do everything we can to minimize those impacts. And we think that working with the pipeline company, even in this, the most challenging of situations, ultimately yields the best outcome from the trail.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you've mentioned potential impacts a couple of times. What are the potential impacts, like for someone who isn't aware of them?
Yeah, and I'll start this answer by saying there's a separate sort of process going on now that is really tied to specific impacts to the trail. So a specific impact might be, you see the pipeline from this overlook, right? That's an impact. And again, there's a separate process for that. We are fully engaged in that process, identifying those impacts and addressing them, with all the experience that we have at ATC. The agreement, the money that we accepted, is not focused on those impacts, but rather it's focused on ATC's ability to apply those funds across a really broad landscape in ways that will benefit, the central part of the recreation economies in this whole region, which is the AT itself. So just saying that. But the impacts, you will see the pipeline corridor in the distance from, somewhere between 6 and 10 kind of vistas on the trail. And those range from, 10 miles off to 4 miles off, and sometimes closer. I think the closest one is, that's Sims Gap. That's probably 1.5 miles off. So that pipeline, especially like right after construction, you're going to be able to see that linear swath of cleared land about a mile or more off in the distance. Now, we have done a ton of work to institute techniques that minimize that visual impact. And you can imagine, for a second, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but a cleared football field, a cleared width of a football field in straight lines for a long time is a noticeable thing. There are ways to feather the edges of those kind of long lines of cleared things to affect, the aspect of the view. And that really has a big difference in certain views. And so we're working really hard on that. I think long-term that will minimize the visual impact from a lot of places and frankly, eliminate it from some places. We're hoping that the pipeline company agrees to do a ton of that work. They are not legally required to do that work in a lot of places, but we are hoping that they agree to do that work, and we're really advocating strongly for them to do so. So that's I think probably the biggest impact, right?
So
Somewhere.
the biggest impact is the view in less than 10 spots. You'll be able to see a clearing in the trees.
It's a linear corridor, so not like a
Yeah. So
yeah.
my family has a stay house drink. There's a pipeline that goes through it. So there's like you said, like a football field wide,
Right.
and it's just like a line that goes down the forest. So
Right.
that's basically, you'd see this clearing of a line from like 4 to 6
in
locations.
the worst case scenario. Now, if we're successful in advocating for these minimization techniques, I think what you'll see is, instead of 2 straight lines, you'll see, like, it'll be like, the big trees, and then smaller trees, and then scrub, and that scrub will kind of be, and there'll only be, maybe a 10, 15, maybe 20 foot, essentially grassy corridor in the middle of that, with kind of feathered edges and undulating edges. And that has a big impact on how it looks. So hopefully we can be successful in getting the pipeline company to agree to some of those techniques. So the other impact that will occur is from the boring under the trail of the pipe itself. And so, initially the pipeline company proposed a 100-foot setback on either side. And, sorry, I get a cramp. And that was completely unacceptable. And we really banged on them and the Forest Service hard to maximize that setback. That setback is now 315 feet on either side of the trail, which, doesn't seem like that much. But you got to realize this is on a really narrow ridge. And if you go 315 feet out from the ridge, you're also going down a significant way. And so that bore will go under the trail, 350, about a football field length on either side. But, 100 feet maybe below the trail itself on either side. And so there will be some, you might be able to hear it. You won't be able to see the bore pit locations. I've been out to these spots dozens of times, and with flagging and really tried to hone in on will you be able to see the bore pits. I do not think you'll be able to see the bore pits. You may be able to hear the bore pits. Another thing we're really hoping that the pipeline company agrees to is to put some sound barriers around those bore locations to shield any potential sound pollution from hikers. We're also hopeful to establish, boring schedules. I mean, you guys know, hikers, they kind of, they go to the same overnight sites, they wake up at the same time, they hike the same distances. And if we can get those boring operations to occur outside the time when hikers generally pass that location, I think we can do a lot to minimize that impact. We still have to evaluate a lot of that stuff, and those impact evaluations are ongoing. So I'm not 100% sure that you will be able to hear that boring operation, but it's something that we are certainly concerned about, and working as hard as we can to minimize. That said, that just the ability for a hiker to hear the operation was not going to stop this pipeline. So now we have to minimize that as much as we can through this variety of techniques that I've been rambling about. And essentially they could just say no, and potentially still build the pipeline. I mean, so we're trying to use every stick and carrot we can to get the best possible outcome for the trail. That takes a variety that looks like a bunch of different things in a bunch of different places.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I guess I'm confused on the huge downsides to it, because if I'm thinking about it in terms of like a couple of views are going to look different, like, and correct me if like there's a way I'm not seeing this, but if I'm looking at it in terms of like a couple of the views I see are going to look different slightly, and in exchange, like the trail can be improved drastically in these other areas with all this money that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Like, to me, it feels a little selfish for me personally to say, I need that view, so they can't have that. Like, for me, it's like when we did that charity and it was like, how much would you have to raise for the trail systems to get a butt tattoo? And it's like, well, how much is my butt worth compared to this donation to the trail? Like,
by the way, the answer was
4 to 6 views.
$100,000, Andy.
Yeah,
That's
and
it?
we did not raise that. We rose 1%.
God, I get a butt
1.5%.
tattoo for like a good ham sandwich.
Yeah, no thanks. That's all you. But I guess like the part I'm confused with is like, at what point is the benefits of what you can do for the trail with the money outweighing like what you lose from like people not getting to see like the full view? Like, I feel like that's like a, oh my God, I won't get to see the full view. Like, look at all the other good things we can do from this. Or is there like a big downside that I'm just missing?
Well,
Andy, can I step in? Because I can say
Yeah.
things that you can't, because I'm not tied. I'm my boss.
Thumb this down for
I have
me,
an
Zach.
answer for it, by the way. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things happening here. A lot of it is just social media momentum. I think a lot of misinformation gets spread and that snowballs and people just pile on hate, and they took a deal which was worth a lot of money, and in the eyes of a lot of people that's just not going to sit well, especially considering it was a thing that they used to fight. And I think that just spreads the disinformation machine. I think that there are probably personal property owners that have very legitimate gripes, but in my opinion, that it's not the ATC's job to advocate for them. That's a whole different conversation. Not to say that the pipeline should happen, but I think
Right.
that people who are actually being impacted by this have real gripes, but it's not necessarily the ATC's job to go to bat for them. If you want to get mad at everybody who consumes anything that's not a non-renewable source of energy. Like, we're all to blame. Pipelines happen because we consume natural gas, we consume coal, we consume these things that require pipes. So if we want to get rid of pipes in the future, we have to move to solar, wind, nuclear, those sorts of things. I hope
I'm glad you threw in.
Yeah,
I'm glad you threw in nuclear, because my dad was in nuclear power for his entire career, and put me through school. But my answer was similar to yours. At ATC, we have the luxury of speaking for the trail and only for the trail, right? There could be a variety of concerns around any project that don't involve the trail, that are legitimate and problematic and important. My job is only to speak for the trail, to analyze and talk about impacts to the trail, and make the best decision I can with the most information I can that's specifically relative to the trail itself. That, in a lot of ways, is a luxury, because these projects, they have massive implications across, all over the place. And, as you were saying, Zach, that's a big suite, potentially of problems. That's also, potentially a big suite of, people who need energy for whatever transmission line or whatever it is. I don't do all that. There are a lot of good organizations that do. There are a lot of great organizations whose mission is like, broad environmentalism. There's only one organization that's dedicated to the trail and only the trail, and that's ATC. And so we have to be very focused and very specific in our decision-making process. That is a big challenge, right? Because it's very complicated, and there's always kind of new threats coming out of the woodwork everywhere. But it's also, in a way, a luxury, because we can limit our scope, down to a trail, down to one thing, one footpath. And so some folks who have problems with energy infrastructure, with power lines going through their yard, or affecting a community or a specific community of threatened and endangered species, or whatever it is, I don't want to devalue their position, because they're likely experts in what they do, and maybe they're the blinders that they have on are very focused on the salamander or whatever it is, and that is, I don't want to devalue that again in any way, but my focus is the trail and the trail itself, and only the trail. And we're the only organization that does that. And honestly, if we start getting too far afield, right? If we start, bringing in concerns or benefits like way out there, it keeps us from focusing on the trail and decreases our ability to do good for the trail in the short and the long term. So we really have to stay focused on the trail and the trail itself, because like I said, we're the only organization that does that for the trail in its entirety.
I think if we talk about the pipeline anymore, we're gonna either talk in circles or get into nitty gritty that I don't think I would say the vast majority of our listeners even care about at this point. So, Chaunce, let's see if we have another question. It did sound like I was about to cut you off.
I had one more, which was you mentioned endangered species. I'm going to sneeze. Oh no, I lost it because I thought about it too much. I thought too hard.
By the way, that's how you get rid of a sneeze, is do it on a podcast.
I always try not to think about it, and then it makes me think about it more. I was going to say, because you had mentioned endangered species and salamanders, and I know we're talking about Virginia, are there areas where it's going to affect endangered species, or are there areas where it's going to impact ecosystems to an extent that should cause concern more than just hey, we're going through this area, versus hey, this is going to severely impact the ecosystem?
That has been a massive issue with this and other projects, and I think there are organizations and people whose mission in life is endangered species, is habitat restoration and stuff like that. If I were to speak on that, I would immediately come up short, because that's not my expertise. That's not where I went to school, my degrees. That's not my career of experience. So I won't talk about that. But what I will say is there are great organizations that are doing a lot of great work around T&E, threatened and endangered species, and look at them. And if that's what compels you, then look at that data and make a decision. If what compels you is the AT, then I can speak more about why we made our decision we did. But there are great organizations out there doing great work, and I would leave it to them.
It's a great point. Money talks, and if enough money goes to the organizations that are fighting specific issues, it certainly does not hurt the odds of that winning. Okay, let's go to
I'm just curious, would those not apply to the AT? Are those not also the AT? The ecosystems that you go through?
So the specific ecosystem of the AT itself, that management area, it would, right? And we have looked at those specific impacts. I think the avoidance of the boar itself, right, affects a lot of things. I think the Forest Service does evaluations on threatened and endangered species in that sort of AT management area. And I haven't seen, for the specific AT environment, I haven't seen that the construction of that particular pipeline would have this massive effect on those particular habitats in the AT management area. A power line, for example, might be a different story because of the clearing, and that you can't feather those edges of a power line because trees grow up and get in the way of the power line corridor and things like that. So it's a little bit of different, apples and oranges, I guess. But I haven't seen compelling data around the AT management area and T&E to affect those decisions. But I have seen analysis of that come out of the Forest Service and other places.
That answers my question.
Sure. And so if we're going to move on, I'm happy to move on. Gosh, happy to move on. But I want to reiterate to folks, the ATC should be held accountable for the application of these funds and these funds' ability to improve the hiking experience and protect the hiking experience. And as people who love the trail, and I know you both do, people who love the AT specifically and who want to see it protected in perpetuity, should be and are concerned about this, should follow that story, because I have a high degree of confidence that we can and will apply these funds in a way that ultimately, protects the AT. But, trust but verify, right? And so I invite everybody to hold us accountable for that work, because I think that's important.
Yeah, no, civil engagement of any kind is amazing, and I love to see it. I just want to make sure that these conversations are rooted in facts, which is why we're very happy to have you on the show. And I'm sure I'll get a lot of angry emails from people that have contrary beliefs, and let's just keep the debate going. I love it so much. So let's go to a lighter subject: pandemics. I know we obviously talked about last year already, but so I think the other thing that was big news, and I'm sure there was a compounding effect between just like the proximity for when these became big news stories, but the ATC, I want to say a month ago or so, put out the request for people that were considering doing any long distance backpacking on the AT to once again postpone their hikes as you did last year. And in addition to that, you also said that you will, because the ATC manages through hiking numbers and does the whole recognition through like the headquarters at Harper's Ferry and Springer and Katahdin and all that. You said that you will not be doing that this year. So if you could speak to how ultimately that decision was arrived to, and then I guess we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, all your listeners, I am less involved in those management decisions than I have been in managing and addressing threats like all these pipelines, the pipelines I worked on, and the power lines and development and all that sort of other stuff. So if I don't have information, it's not because I'm trying to be elusive. It's just because, those aren't my suite of responsibilities at ATC. That said, I think one of the important pieces of context that folks haven't had access to is how seriously ATC took that decision-making process, right? And how laborious it was, and how much conversation there was about it, and how concerned we were and are, I think, about the variety of impacts and outcomes and all that sort of stuff relative to our decision to provide guidance for people to postpone their through hikes. And so I just want to start out by saying that it's a massive decision for ATC, something we took really, really seriously, and was challenging. I mean, even a year after kind of this pandemic had started, it's still, it was in last March, the unpredictability came from, what is this virus? How does it transmit? Where are areas of exposure? How do we keep local communities safe, et cetera, et cetera? I think a lot of the uncertainty now is like, how many vaccines are going to be available? Who's going to get vaccinated? What's the distribution of vaccines across the AT landscape? Is it different in Virginia than it is in Pennsylvania? And how does that affect our decision-making process? How will hikers react? What is our actual ability to affect change on the trail? Are people going to listen or not? So a lot of that came into it. I think, one of the things that I've worked on in the past, I've worked on, I think, 2 other disease-related issues at ATC, hantavirus and norovirus. Those experiences from an organizational standpoint really helped inform our decision-making process about 2021 and this year. And I know it seems, for some people, it seems like, yeah, of course, it's a pandemic. People should stay at home. People should not be bouncing in and out of these rural communities. For other people, it's like, we're in the woods. I can take care of myself. It's okay. And so I think there's this kind of recognition that there's a variety of opinions among the hiking populace. And which is why, with one hand, essentially we're saying, please stay home. If you can postpone your hike, do it. With the other hand, we're doing our best to provide people who choose to go out to the trail with the best possible information to keep them safe, and the people in AT community safe as well. So there's some recognition there that I think there's going to be a variety of responses from the hiking community, and we want to be an information point for people no matter what decision they choose. And that's a tough position to be in, but I think it's also kind of a realistic position. I mean, me personally, I've hung up signs that say "Do not throw trash in a privy," and I've also dug privies out and picked out trash by hand. So it's like you gotta hope that people follow guidance that you think is sound, but you also got to prepare for people to not follow that guidance. And ultimately, I think that's what ATC is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, this is so tough, and I don't see this being either black or white. I recently wrote about the Trex policy. I had a lot of people asking, and like I kind of avoided it for the longest time because I see both sides of it so hard, and like there's so many other looming factors. Like they're saying that the British variant is going to come, and like cases are going to spike again, and then like if I say that thru hiking is okay, then and people are out during that spike, like there's just so many factors to consider. Ultimately, we came to the decision that we were not going to close the platform to thru-hikers this year for a variety of reasons. And I'll get into that later, maybe.
I read the piece. I think it was a good piece.
I appreciate that. But within the piece, I also made the statement that if I work at the ATC, or I think if any of us work at the ATC, we would probably arrive to the same conclusion. Like, you are responsible for literally thousands of hikers. And to your point about digging trash out of privies, like you have to issue your guidance to the lowest common denominator because of the perception and the liability and all that stuff. I try to take a different approach and try to reason with people. And I think advise based on what I thought was going to happen anyways, and what I thought hypocrisy was, what I was seeing in other realms of the world. So I just think this is a really difficult conversation, but I just want to make clear that like it's really difficult. I think it's hard for anyone to fault the ATC for arriving to that conclusion, even though I don't entirely agree with it for what the Trek is doing.
Well, I understand that you think it'd be hard to fault ATC. I know that people are faulting us like left and right, so it can't be that hard.
We get shit too. If you take a stance, you're pissing somebody off. Like that's all that it is.
Yeah, a lot of this is tempered by the process we went through last year,
right?
Which was a little bit helter skelter, right, because of the nature of the disease outbreak, but the connections we had to communities. I mean, there were a lot of AT communities that were scared shitless, right? For these like people from all over the world coming into their community and then leaving, and then a whole new group. I mean, they were really scared, and rightly so. And so I think that was really a part of the decision-making process that I think maybe your average hiker might not be informed about. The other thing, and I'll go back to it, is norovirus. I mean, I think a lot of people, we dealt with norovirus outbreak a couple times on the AT that have been relatively significant, and people are like, I'll stick to myself, I'll be fine. But in reality, what happens is, what we saw a lot of is like rain, right? So it pours for like 3 days, and people crowd into a shelter. Right. And they didn't want to, but they think, I'll be fine now. And then boom, all of a sudden, like 20 people are puking their guts out in their tent the next day. And so given the stakes around COVID, it's like, well, we've already seen a pattern of behavior that really informs the process here. We need to be respective of that pattern of behavior as we make decisions. And that's why we've stressed things like, if you choose to go hiking, please plan on bringing a tent and using a tent every single night as your like standard operating procedure. Because that one time that you're like, oh crap, it's raining, I don't want to dig my tent out, I'll just pop in the shelter. there's always somebody who like strolls in at like 11 at night, like moves you over, right? And then, I to have that person like cough in, or, maybe being asymptomatic or whatever, is just, it could really snowball really quick. It could be a way where we're really, it's tough to get a handle on information between AT communities, or between groups of hikers, or between kind of bubbles within, and it'll just get out of hand really fast. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to see anybody get sick while they're on the trail, or because they were hiking, or because they're a citizen in one of these communities. But it was a massively challenging decision-making process. And I just kind of want to speak to kind of some of the data points that we use from our experience. Again, that goes multiple, disease outbreaks, right? And that people may not kind of have the information to reference. And so, I think that ATC made the right decision. I understand how people could come to a different decision completely. But what I hope is that people look at ATC and look at our breadth of experience and understand the fact that all we want is for people to hike on the trail. All we want is for the trail to be the best possible experience it can be. All we want is for as many people from every community to enjoy that experience. That is all we want. Like to say, don't through hike is antithetical. I mean, it's really bizarre, but that I think speaks to the severity of the situation, and we take that really seriously. So I understand that people may not like it, but I hope they understand that, one, we're coming from a place where we want the best for the trail and hikers, and two, we've got a lot of relevant experience that has added to this process.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have any say in trail days? Like, to me, it seems so silly that trail days is happening and then the ATC is requesting people not through hike.
We don't have any say. Like, that's the Damascus thing. Damascus is a key and core partner to ATC. We love Damascus. I think they have a ton of meetings and a ton of discussion about this as well. I think one of the things that people should understand is just how financially important trail days is to Damascus's, viability. I mean, this town has like 800 people in it. Trail days is massive for their income and their vitality and all that stuff. And they missed one last year. And so, I completely understand how kind of grave and serious this decision making is for them. The Virginia is still under, I hope this is right. I think this is right. Virginia is still under like a group size limit. So, there are going to be some realities, I think, that some tough choices on the side of Damascus if that doesn't get lifted. But I appreciate their optimism, right? I mean, that you can't be the friendliest town on the trail without some optimism. And, they're showing a lot of it right now. I think as we get closer to trail days, how things shake out are really going to affect things one way or the other. And they seem to be really on top of a process, right? I think right now they're hoping for the best, but they are, I think, taking this really seriously. They got a new mayor in town who's excellent, who's really responsible, who understands a lot of this stuff, and is continue. I mean, Damascus, it's like all they think about all year is trail days. Once the last trail days is over, they immediately go in and start planning the next one. And so this is like this ongoing process. They're constantly having these conversations and evaluating what's going on, and we want the best for them.
To that point, that is obviously one of the arguments that people will make in terms of why thru hiking shouldn't be canceled, is that a lot of these small towns rely on the income from the hiking community. Obviously not just thru hikers, because a couple thousand people aren't going to make or break, but just like hiking in general. Have you and maybe this is outside of the scope of your position, but have you had a lot of input from the businesses of the trail towns, either before you made the guidance or after you made the guidance, saying like, please don't discourage through hiking because we need the money to sustain our livelihoods?
I know I was part of a number of community calls with a bunch of reps from a variety of towns, and I think there were a lot of people who spoke to, exactly your point, like, hey, we need this for our economic vitality. There were a lot of other people also who said, hey, I don't want a hiker give me COVID and then die. So the spectrum of concerns, I think, from my observation, was really across the board. We try to take and listen to all those concerns seriously, but ultimately, our decision kind of took those into account, but also took a ton of other data as well. And I think one thing that we should remember is it's a pandemic. Like, until the pandemic is over, there's no solutions, right? There's no good news. There's no, it's just, we all collectively as a trail family have to get to the finish line. And it's not, there's no, the upside essentially is really muted when you have now 500,000 people dead in America.
Yeah. We talk enough about coronavirus. It's actually become a theme that we talk about coronavirus and then that we're not going to talk about coronavirus on the show. So I don't know if there's too much more that can be said on the subject. I think the debate is fairly obvious because it applies in all spectrums of life, not just through hiking. I appreciate your giving the ATC side of it, which I think is logical. Chaunce, before I put a bow on it, do you have any other questions about COVID or really anything for Andy?
No.
Cool.
Come on.
Well, we're way over what I told you we needed your time for tonight. So thank you again for being very generous with your time. Thank you for answering these questions. I know it's really important for the community. And yeah, I know this has probably not been your favorite last few weeks as a member of the ATC or even just like the AT community in general. Like the through hiking and hiking in general is supposed to be like a happy subject. And unfortunately, we're in a time where nothing is quite that simple. And, obviously there's some other factors going into why your job is exceptionally challenging at this point. So I really appreciate you coming on and giving your side of the story. And yeah, where should people go if they want to keep up with you or ongoing guidance with the ATC, or here's your red carpet to inform our listeners on what they should know?
We have a Preparing for 2021 webpage, Plan and Prepare Hiking Basics on AppalachianTrail.org. That's also the place that will be kind of first presenting a lot of the work that we do to apply the funds from Mountain Valley Pipeline. So, whether it's, we've kind of hit on both those topics today. Both of those are addressed or will be addressed at our website. I think that's probably the best thing to do. I just want to say, to reiterate, before to put a bow on it, I guess from my end, I'm a 2002 thru-hiker, and like I said, I've dedicated my career in service of the trail. But I'm not unique in that regard at ATC. I mean, my counterpart in the South and my counterpart in the North, both are thru-hikers, both have 30-year careers doing the exact same thing that I've now spent 14 years on. Sandy, our CEO, love her or hate her, she's been doing actual physical trail work since the 90s. Like, not like this bureaucratic decision making. She's out there with the tool since the 90s doing this work. And so while you can disagree, while you can, be disappointed, be upset, I would ask everybody to understand that the ATC is full of people who love the trail, who love hiking, who love what it means to through hike, and that is central within all our decision making processes. We take it super, super seriously. And I'm not suggesting that you can't disagree with us because of that. You certainly can. But in that disagreement, please understand that, down to a person, I think we all love the AT and want the best for the AT and the best for hikers.
Well said. And I also want to give an additional shout out to Jordan Bowman, who's also a thru-hiker and one of the first writers for Appalachian Trials. So he's, I forget his official title, but he's like the head of marketing, something. Communications. There it is.
Yeah, and you guys said, was it Ann Baker?
Ann was too. That's
Ann
right.
Baker's,
Yeah.
I mean,
very incestuous. Well, thank you again so much for your time. It's been, I know obviously this has been probably not a very fun couple of weeks for you, but I really appreciate you coming on and discussing these subjects, and very much appreciate all the great work you do for the Appalachian Trail.
Thank you guys. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Take care. Thank you for that lively conversation, Andy. If you want to send hate mail my way, that is julianachauncey@gmail.com. Okay.
Excuse me.
Should we edit that out?
No, send me your hate mail. I'll laugh at it. Maybe I'll post screenshots of it.
There we go. Yes, please direct all hate mail to Juliana.